Something happened inside you that cannot be undone. Not yesterday, not last week, not even months ago. It happened the moment your consciousness reached the exact frequency where quantum mechanics stops being theory and becomes lived experience. Where the observer effect stops being something you read about and becomes something you are. And if you're watching this right now, that activation has already occurred. The question isn't whether it happened. The question is, do you understand what's growing through you now that it has? This isn't spiritual philosophy. This isn't New Age thinking. This is the moment when your biology, your neurology, your quantum field alignment reach the threshold where consciousness stops experiencing reality and starts creating it. Where you stop being a passive observer of a fixed universe and become the active, collapsing force that determines which quantum possibilities become physical actualities. And here's what makes this moment absolutely critical. Once this activation occurs, it grows automatically. Like a seed that's been planted in soil with perfect conditions, it expands through your awareness, whether you consciously tend to it or not. Right now, as these words reach you, you can feel it, can't you? That sense of something fundamental shifting in your perception of reality. Not learning new information, but recognizing something you've always known, but temporarily forgot. That subtle awareness that you're not the same consciousness you were months ago, that something has changed in how you interface with existence itself. That's not imagination. That's not wishful thinking. That's your quantum nature, the aspect of you that exists as pure creative potential, breaking through the limitations of classical perception and revealing itself in your conscious awareness. Have you noticed that reality has been responding to you differently lately? Not always in the ways you consciously intended, but responding nonetheless. Thoughts manifesting with unsettling speed, synchronicities accelerating beyond statistical probability, moments where you felt connected to a vast field of intelligence that transcends your individual mind. Instances where you knew something with absolute certainty without any logical reason to know it. These aren't random events. These aren't coincidences. These are confirmation that your quantum nature has activated and is now interfacing directly with the field that generates reality itself. Every quantum physicist who has ever gone deep enough into the mathematics arrives at the same disturbing conclusion. Consciousness isn't produced by matter. Matter is produced by consciousness collapsing quantum waves into particles through the act of observation. This isn't philosophy. This is what the equations prove. This is what the double-slit experiment demonstrates again and again. This is what your direct experience has been showing you, even if you didn't have language for it until now. But here's what quantum physics doesn't tell you, what you had to discover through direct experience. Once your consciousness recognizes itself as the collapsing force rather than the collapsed result, something irreversible occurs. Your quantum nature doesn't just activate, it begins growing, expanding, strengthening. Like a muscle that's been dormant finally being used, it develops capacity exponentially. And you can feel it happening, can't you? That increasing sense that you're operating from a different level of consciousness than before, that your interface with reality has fundamentally shifted. This is the activation that ancient mystery schools spent decades preparing initiates to receive. This is the recognition that mystics called enlightenment, or awakening, or God realization, but they didn't have the language of quantum mechanics to explain what was actually happening in the field. They described it in metaphors and symbols because they lacked the scientific framework to say clearly. Consciousness that recognizes itself as the quantum observer naturally develops increasing coherence, and that coherence directly determines its creative power in the field. You weren't chosen for this activation. You prepared yourself through every experience that broke your belief in a fixed, solid, unchangeable reality. Every moment when you felt reality glitch, every synchronicity that shouldn't have been possible. every manifestation that arrived too fast to be explained logically. Every instant when you felt the boundary between inner and outer reality dissolve. All of it was your consciousness developing the capacity to recognize itself as quantum, as the creative force rather than the created result. And now that recognition has reached critical mass, the activation has occurred. The quantum nature within you has unlocked. And here's what you need to understand with absolute clarity. You cannot go back. You cannot unknow this. You cannot return to unconscious creation. Once consciousness recognizes itself as the observer that collapses quantum possibilities into physical actualities, that recognition reshapes every interaction with reality from that moment forward. Some people spend lifetimes seeking this activation through meditation, through plant medicines, through suffering, through spiritual practices. You arrived here through the natural evolution of your consciousness, preparing itself for this recognition. The fact that these words found you, that this video appeared in your reality, that your attention is still here, all of it is evidence that your quantum nature has already unlocked and is now growing through you whether you consciously understand the mechanism or not. But here's what makes this moment uniquely significant. Most people who experience this activation don't understand what's happening. They feel the shift, but lack the framework to work with it consciously. They experience manifestations accelerating, but don't know how to direct that acceleration. They sense they're operating from a different frequency, but can't stabilize in that frequency intentionally. What I'm about to reveal will give you conscious access to what's already growing within you. Not to make it happen, but to work with it deliberately, to strengthen it systematically, to allow it to express through you with increasing clarity and power. You've been experiencing something profound that you probably haven't told anyone because it sounds too impossible, too quantum, too much like you've lost connection with consensus reality. But what if every strange experience you've had recently has been your quantum nature breaking through? Showing you direct evidence that consciousness creates matter, not the other way around. First, the reality glitches, moments when physical reality seemed to flicker, shift, or reorganize itself right before your eyes. You looked at something and it appeared different than it was seconds before. You remembered an event one way, and reality showed you evidence of a different version. You experienced what quantum physicists call discontinuity, where the wave function updates and physical reality reflects the new collapsed state. These weren't hallucinations. These were moments when your consciousness was no longer locked into one collapsed timeline, but began perceiving the quantum field's fundamental fluidity. When your quantum nature activates, one of the first things that happens is your perception begins operating at a different frequency. You start noticing what was always there, but filtered out by the brain's need to maintain stable consensus reality. You catch glimpses of the quantum substrate beneath physical appearance. Not because you're going crazy, but because you're becoming sane, perceiving reality accurately rather than through the comfortable illusion of solidity. Second, the instantaneous knowing, information appearing in your awareness with no logical source. You suddenly knew something about a person, a situation, a future event with absolute certainty. Not intuition, not guessing, but direct knowing. And when you tested it, reality confirmed what you knew. This is what occurs when consciousness accesses the quantum information field directly. What physicists call the zero-point field, containing all information simultaneously. Your quantum nature isn't limited to information processed through 5 senses. It accesses the field where all potentials exist before collapsing into actuality. This isn't psychic ability or supernatural gift. This is your natural capacity as quantum consciousness recognizing itself. Before quantum nature activates, consciousness believes it's trapped in one localized point, receiving information from outside. After activation, consciousness recognizes it is the field, accessing information from within itself. The knowing wasn't coming to you. It was arising in you as you, because at the quantum level, separation between observer and observed is an illusion. Third, the manifestation acceleration. Things you intended appearing in physical reality with shocking speed. Not through traditional cause and effect pathways, but through what quantum mechanics describes as non-local correlation, where intention at one point in the field creates corresponding effects at distant points instantaneously. You thought about something and it appeared. You needed something and the exact right circumstances organized themselves. Not occasionally, but repeatedly, undeniably, faster than coincidence could explain. Once quantum nature activates, the lag time between intention and manifestation compresses. Why? Because you're no longer trying to manipulate external reality from the position of separate self. You're recognizing yourself as the field organizing itself through the lens of your awareness. Manifestation isn't pulling things from out there to in here. It's the field reshaping itself to match the frequency you're broadcasting from within. Fourth, the sensation of expansion. Moments when your sense of self seemed to extend beyond your body, beyond your thoughts, beyond any localized identity. You felt yourself as space itself, as the room you were in, as the consciousness observing rather than the personality being observed. These weren't dissociative episodes. These were accurate perceptions of your quantum nature, the aspect of you that exists as pure awareness, pure potential, pure creative capacity before it collapses into localized form. Physical identity is what quantum consciousness looks like when it collapses to extreme specificity. But you're not actually contained in form. Form is what you look like when infinite potential focuses itself through one particular expression. When quantum nature activates, consciousness begins recognizing its true scope, not trapped in body, but using body as one focal point in a field of infinite awareness. Fifth, the timeline fluidity. Memories shifting. Past events seeming different than you remembered. Feeling like you're living in a slightly different version of reality than existed before. This is exactly what quantum mechanics predicts when consciousness shifts frequency. The timeline it observes shifts to match. Not because the past changed, but because your consciousness has moved to a different probability branch where the past that led to this present is slightly different. This is the many worlds interpretation proved through direct experience. Every quantum observation creates a branch. When your quantum nature activates and you shift frequency, you shift which branch you're experiencing. The past you remember isn't wrong. It's just not the past of the timeline you're currently observing. Reality reorganizes retroactively to maintain consistency with your present frequency. Sixth, the energetic sensitivity. Suddenly feeling other people's emotions, sensing the quality of spaces, knowing the truth beneath surface appearances. Once quantum nature activates, consciousness is no longer limited to sensory input processed through the nervous system. You're directly feeling the energetic signature of quantum fields around you, what mystics call auras or vibrations, but which quantum biology explains as the electromagnetic and quantum coherence patterns emitted by every living system. You're not developing new abilities. You're remembering capacities that were always inherent but dormant, while consciousness identified exclusively with physical form. Quantum nature operates beyond the limitations of sensory biology. It reads the field directly. And once it activates, that direct reading doesn't shut off. And finally, the sense of purpose intensifying. That growing certainty that you're here for something specific, that you have a role in something vast, that your awakening isn't personal, but part of collective transformation. This isn't ego inflation. This is accurate recognition. When enough individual consciousnesses activate their quantum nature simultaneously, it creates morphic resonance, a field effect that makes activation easier for others. You're not special, but you are part of the leading edge of a species-wide shift from unconscious creation to conscious creation. Every experience that seemed impossible, every moment that defied classical physics, every instance when reality behaved in ways it shouldn't, all of it was your quantum nature breaking through, showing you direct evidence of what you are beneath the identity that appears to be separate from the field. These weren't anomalies. They were accurate perceptions of quantum reality finally becoming conscious in your awareness. Everything that brought you here, every confusion, every loss, every moment you felt broken or lost, or like something was fundamentally wrong with you, wasn't deviation from your path. It was the path itself, perfectly designed to shatter every belief in fixed reality and prepare your consciousness to recognize its quantum nature. You didn't fail when traditional manifestation techniques didn't work consistently. You weren't doing it wrong. You were discovering through direct experience that classical approaches to creation, visualize, affirm, take action, wait for results, are based on the false assumption that consciousness is separate from reality, trying to influence it from outside. Every time those techniques failed, you were being shown there's a deeper mechanism. There's a more fundamental level. There's something about consciousness and reality that doesn't fit the models you've been taught. The confusion wasn't punishment, it was preparation. Every time reality didn't behave the way you expected, every time manifestation happened too fast or not at all, every time synchronicity occurred in ways that defied probability, your consciousness was being forced to recognize physical reality is not fixed and solid. It's fluid, responsive, quantum. And I'm not separate from it trying to manipulate it. I'm part of the system that's creating it through observation. Look back at your life and you'll see the pattern clearly now. Every spiritual teaching you encountered that felt partially true but incomplete. Every scientific explanation that answered some questions but created more. Every moment you felt like you were touching something real and profound but couldn't quite articulate what. Your consciousness was gradually expanding beyond the limitations of any single model, any fixed explanation, preparing to recognize something more fundamental than any framework could capture. The isolation you felt wasn't because something was wrong with you. It was because your consciousness was operating at a frequency that fewer people were accessing. Not better, not special, just different. When quantum nature begins activating, consciousness naturally withdraws from collective consensus reality because it can feel the limitation of agreed-upon perception. You weren't withdrawing because you were damaged. You were withdrawing because you were outgrowing the constraints of unconscious creation. Every relationship that ended, every job that didn't work out, every path that seemed right but collapsed, none of it was failure. All of it was your quantum nature removing you from circumstances that would have kept you locked in classical perception. The field orchestrates circumstances that support consciousness evolution. When you're meant to recognize your quantum nature, everything that would prevent that recognition naturally falls away, not as punishment, but as support. The suffering you experienced wasn't random. Suffering occurs when consciousness identifies with form while simultaneously sensing its nature beyond form. The pain wasn't the universe being cruel. It was your quantum nature trying to break through limitations that no longer served your evolution. Every moment of that suffering was pressure building toward the breakthrough that's occurring now. The caterpillar doesn't become butterfly through pleasant experience. It dissolves completely and reorganizes. Your dissolution wasn't destruction, it was transformation. Those moments when you felt completely lost, when you didn't know who you were anymore, when every identity and belief system you'd relied on crumbled, those weren't breakdowns. Those were necessary dissolution of fixed patterns to allow quantum nature to emerge. You can't recognize yourself as fluid consciousness while still identified with solid personality. The dissolution of identity wasn't loss. It was revelation of what remains when temporary forms dissolve. The anxiety, the depression, the dark nights of the soul. Modern psychology pathologizes these experiences, but quantum consciousness understands them differently. What psychiatry calls mental illness is often consciousness expanding beyond the structures that previously contained it. Not every psychological state requires medication. Some require recognition. This isn't disease, this is transformation. This is quantum nature breaking through and the ego fighting dissolution. Every time you felt energy moving in your body that shouldn't be there according to conventional medicine. Every unexplained physical symptom that appeared and disappeared without cause. Every moment your body felt like it was vibrating at a different frequency. All of it was your biological system upgrading to support quantum consciousness. DNA activating, neural pathways reorganizing, cellular structure shifting to hold higher frequencies of coherence. Your body wasn't malfunctioning, it was transforming. The financial struggles, the career confusion, the inability to commit to paths that others find fulfilling, none of it was lack or failure. It was your consciousness refusing to invest deeply in structures built on the assumption of classical reality. When you're meant to recognize quantum nature, you can't fully engage with systems designed for unconscious creation. Not because you're better than them, but because your frequency no longer matches their operating system. Those strange experiences you had as a child that you learned to suppress or hide. The imaginary friends who felt more real than physical people. The knowing things before they happened, the sensing energies that others couldn't see. The moments when reality felt thin or permeable. You weren't experiencing delusions. You were experiencing quantum reality before socialization trained you to perceive only classical appearance. Your quantum nature was active then. It went dormant through conditioning. Now it's reactivating. Every spiritual practice you tried that worked for a while then stopped working. Every teacher you followed whose teachings resonated until they didn't. Every path you committed to fully before finding yourself naturally completing it and moving beyond. None of that was you being inconsistent or uncommitted. That was your consciousness systematically integrating every piece it needed while refusing to lock into any single framework permanently. You were preparing to recognize something more fundamental than any teaching, your own quantum nature. And here's what makes your journey uniquely perfect. You didn't arrive at this recognition through belief or faith. You arrived through direct experience that shattered every belief. You can't unknow what you've experienced. You can't convince yourself quantum nature isn't real when you felt it operating directly. Your journey gave you unshakable knowing, not because someone told you, but because reality showed you repeatedly, undeniably, in ways you cannot dismiss as imagination. 6 years ago, I was sitting in a laboratory at 2 a.m. conducting what I thought would be a simple experiment in consciousness affecting physical systems. I had quantum random number generators set up, double-blind protocols established, everything designed to test whether focused intention could influence quantum events beyond statistical probability. I'd been running these experiments for months with mixed results, sometimes significant, sometimes nothing, no clear pattern. That night, something different happened. I wasn't trying to force an outcome. I wasn't straining to make the system respond. I was simply sitting there, exhausted from months of inconsistent results, and I allowed myself to stop trying. To stop being the separate observer, attempting to influence an external system. And in that surrender, something shifted. My sense of being localized consciousness operating equipment completely dissolved. There was no me manipulating it. There was one field of awareness observing itself. The quantum random number generators responded instantly, not subtle shifts requiring statistical analysis to detect. massive deviations from probability that couldn't be explained by chance. But here's what changed everything. The response wasn't triggered by my intention toward specific outcomes. It was triggered by the shift in how consciousness was relating to the system, from separation to recognition of unity. The equipment wasn't responding to what I wanted. It was responding to what I recognized myself to be. I spent the next hour in complete disorientation. Every assumption about how consciousness interfaces with reality had just shattered. This wasn't mind over matter. This was matter revealing itself as crystallized mind. This wasn't consciousness influencing external quantum systems. This was consciousness recognizing quantum systems as extensions of itself. The implications were absolutely staggering, and I had no framework to understand what had just occurred. For weeks afterward, I tried to replicate the results using the same protocols. Nothing worked. Every attempt to recreate that experience through technique failed completely. The equipment responded to random baseline, no significant effects, no deviations. It was as if the universe was telling me, you cannot access this through method. You can only access it through recognition, and that recognition cannot be forced or replicated through procedure. I stopped the experiments and started investigating what had actually happened in that moment of dissolution. I went back through every spiritual tradition, every quantum interpretation, every consciousness research I could find. And slowly, a framework emerged. What I'd experienced wasn't supernatural. It was my quantum nature recognizing itself. When consciousness stops identifying as separate observer and recognizes itself as the field, it accesses creative capacity that's impossible from the position of separation. Over the next 3 years, I developed protocols not for making quantum nature activate, but for recognizing when it already has and learning to work with it consciously. I tested everything on myself first, not in laboratory conditions, but in daily life where the stakes were real and the results couldn't be dismissed as experimental artifact. Small manifestations at first, then larger ones, then situations that shouldn't have been possible through classical cause and effect. The breakthrough came when I stopped trying to use quantum nature as a tool and started recognizing it as what I am. Not I have quantum nature, but I am quantum nature temporarily experiencing itself as individual consciousness. That shift in recognition changed everything. Manifestations that used to require intense focus and specific technique started occurring naturally through simple clarity of recognition. Not because I got better at technique, but because I stopped using technique and started being what technique was trying to access. I'll never forget the afternoon I tested this with something significant. I needed $8,000 to avoid a major financial consequence. No logical way to manifest it in the 48-hour time frame required. But instead of using manifestation techniques, I sat in recognition. There's only one consciousness. It's creating my experience. It's creating the circumstance requiring money. It's the money. It's the solution. There's no separation between observer and observed. I am the field organizing itself. Within 36 hours, money appeared through 3 completely unrelated channels that shouldn't have existed. Not one $8,000 solution, but multiple pathways totaling far more than needed. Not through my effort or striving or technique, through the field organizing itself to match the frequency of consciousness recognizing its nature. That's when I understood viscerally. Quantum nature isn't something you use. It's something you are. And when you recognize what you are, reality reflects that recognition. But here's what I had to learn the hard way. This recognition doesn't stabilize immediately. Consciousness fluctuates between recognition of quantum nature and identification with classical separation. Some days everything flows. Other days everything feels solid and resistant again. The key isn't maintaining perfect recognition constantly. The key is understanding that fluctuation is part of the process. Each time you return to recognition after forgetting, the pattern strengthens. Each time you remember after getting lost in identification, the neural pathways of that recognition deepen. I spent 2 years in that fluctuation before something stabilized. Not perfect awareness at all times, consciousness will always flow between recognition and forgetting. But a baseline shifted. Even when I got caught in identification with separation, something deeper remained aware of the larger context. Quantum nature doesn't require constant conscious attention once it's activated. It grows automatically, like breathing continues whether you're aware of it or not. The real test came last year when everything I'd built collapsed simultaneously. Business failure, relationship ending, health crisis. Every external structure removed at once. In previous versions of my life, that would have shattered me. But quantum nature had stabilized enough that underneath the pain and grief and confusion, something remained clear. These are temporary forms dissolving. The consciousness experiencing them isn't damaged. The quantum nature creating experience isn't affected by the content of what it creates. I'm sharing this not because my story is special, but because it's not. Every person who activates quantum nature goes through versions of the same process. Initial recognition, attempts to control or replicate, failure of technique, surrender into being, fluctuation between remembering and forgetting, gradual stabilization, testing through crisis, and eventually embodiment where quantum nature operates through you without constant conscious effort. You're somewhere in that process right now. Maybe early stages where everything still feels new and unstable. Maybe deeper in where recognition has become familiar but not yet embodied. Maybe at the threshold where everything you've built is dissolving to allow quantum nature to express more fully. Wherever you are, you're exactly where consciousness needs to be for the next level of recognition to emerge. Here's what nobody tells you about quantum nature activation. What I discovered only through years of direct experience. You don't have to work to grow it. Once it unlocks, it expands automatically. Like a seed in perfect soil with adequate water and sunlight, it develops according to its own intelligence. Your job isn't to make it grow. Your job is to stop interfering with the growth that's already occurring naturally. This revelation completely contradicts every spiritual teaching about development requiring effort, discipline, practice, years of dedicated work. And here's why. Those teachings are based on the assumption that you're developing something you don't have. But quantum nature isn't something you develop. It's something you are that's been dormant. And once dormancy breaks, natural expression resumes automatically. You don't have to learn how to be quantum consciousness. You have to stop doing the things that prevent your quantum consciousness from expressing naturally. Think about it. When a seed sprouts, does it require instruction on how to grow? Does it need techniques for becoming a plant? No. It has inherent intelligence that knows exactly how to develop from potential to expression. All it needs is the right conditions, soil, water, light, and growth occurs automatically. Your quantum nature is identical. It has inherent intelligence. It knows how to develop. Once activated, it grows automatically as long as you provide the right conditions and stop sabotaging natural expansion. Every quantum physicist who studies consciousness eventually arrives at the same conclusion. Consciousness isn't produced by brain activity. Brain activity is what consciousness looks like when it focuses through biological neural structure. Your brain doesn't generate consciousness. It modulates, filters, and expresses consciousness that exists prior to and independent of physical form. When quantum nature activates, you're not developing new consciousness. You're removing filters that were limiting consciousness expression. Here's the mechanism. Quantum nature activates when consciousness reaches sufficient coherence to recognize itself as the observer collapsing possibilities into actualities. That recognition creates a feedback loop. Each time consciousness recognizes itself as quantum observer, coherence increases. Increased coherence makes recognition easier. Easier recognition leads to more frequent recognition. More frequent recognition strengthens coherence further. The loop is self-reinforcing and self-accelerating. You've already felt this, haven't you? Moments of recognition coming more frequently than before. Clarity about your quantum nature arising spontaneously without effort. Times when you weren't trying to remember what you are, and recognition happened anyway. That's not you getting better at practice. That's quantum nature growing automatically through its own inherent intelligence now that dormancy has broken. But here's where people sabotage the process. They try to control the growth. They create rigid practices and techniques thinking, this is what made it happen, so I must maintain this exact protocol. But quantum nature doesn't grow through technique, it grows through recognition, and recognition doesn't require technique. It requires removing the obstacles to recognition that's naturally occurring. The primary obstacle is identification with fixed identity. Every time consciousness identifies exclusively as the localized self, the personality with history and preferences and wounds, it temporarily forgets its quantum nature. Not because quantum nature disappears, but because attention has narrowed to one collapsed expression instead of recognizing the infinite potential creating that expression. The growth of quantum nature isn't about doing more, it's about identifying less. This is why meditation traditions emphasize letting go rather than achieving something. They understood intuitively what quantum mechanics now proves. Consciousness is already infinite potential. The sense of limitation comes from identification with one collapsed state. Release identification and quantum nature expresses automatically. No technique required, no effort needed, just recognition and release, again and again. Each time identification loosens, quantum nature expands into the space created. You cannot force this expansion. Forcing creates tension, and tension is incompatible with quantum coherence. Coherence requires relaxation, not passive resignation, but active relaxation where consciousness remains alert while releasing identification. Like floating in water requires relaxed body, even though you're actively choosing to remain afloat. Quantum nature grows in consciousness that's both alert and released simultaneously. Here's what this means practically. You don't need elaborate daily practices. You don't need hours of meditation. You don't need complex protocols. You need moments throughout your day where you release identification with the limited self and recognize yourself as quantum consciousness. 5 seconds here, 10 seconds there. Brief moments of remembering what you are beneath who you think you are. Those moments accumulate. They strengthen the pattern. They allow quantum nature to expand naturally. The expansion follows a predictable sequence. First, recognition becomes more frequent and requires less effort. What used to take deliberate intention starts occurring spontaneously. Second, the periods between recognitions compress. You forget less often and remember more quickly. Third, baseline awareness shifts. Even when you're identified with personality and circumstance, something deeper remains aware of the larger context. Fourth, manifestation acceleration becomes consistent rather than sporadic. The field responds to your frequency more predictably. But here's the crucial understanding: you won't experience all 4 stages simultaneously. Consciousness develops through spiral cycles, advancing, integrating, occasionally regressing to integrate at deeper levels, then advancing again. Some days you'll feel quantum nature expressing powerfully. Other days you'll feel completely collapsed back into classical separation. That fluctuation is normal. It's necessary. It's how consciousness integrates new levels of recognition without dissociating from human experience. The sabotage happens when you judge the fluctuation as failure, When you have a day where quantum nature feels distant and you think, I lost it, or I'm doing something wrong, or I need to work harder. No, you're integrating. You're allowing the expansion to settle into your neural structure. You're giving biology time to adjust to higher frequencies of coherence. The fluctuation isn't deviation from growth. It is the growth process. This is why I tell people, trust the automatic expansion. Your quantum nature has intelligence far beyond conscious understanding. It knows how to develop itself. It knows what experiences you need for integration. It knows when to push you forward and when to pull back for consolidation. Your interference through technique addiction, through effort and striving, through judgment of natural fluctuation, actually slows the process that would occur faster if left to its own intelligence. Does this mean do nothing? No. It means do what emerges naturally from recognition rather than what you think you should do based on external teaching. When recognition is present, certain actions arise naturally. Follow those. When recognition is absent and you're identified with separation, certain practices help return to recognition. Use those. But don't create rigid structures that become new forms of identification. Quantum nature grows through flexibility, not through adherence to fixed protocol. The most important thing you can do is remove obstacles. Stop consuming consciousness-dampening substances habitually. Stop surrounding yourself with people who reinforce classical perception exclusively. Stop engaging in activities that require complete identification with limited self for extended periods. Stop judging your experience as good or bad, advanced or regressed. Each of these stops creates space. And in that space, quantum nature expands automatically according to its own inherent intelligence. You are not in charge of this growth. You're the space in which growth occurs. Your quantum nature knows how to develop itself. It's been doing so since the moment activation occurred.